We arrived in Split in the late afternoon, so didn't have time to see anything of the town when we arrived. Our own fault, we chose that over getting up at 3:30 in the morning to catch an early flight from Gatwick. There was no one at Split Airport to meet us when we arrived, so had to make some phone calls back to London to tell the boss of Unforgettable Croatia that we'd been forgotten. So we arrived at our boat, the Fantazija, just before everyone else set out on a walk of the old town. Instead, we unpacked and found our way around. There are 38 passengers on the Fantazija. The dining room has 5 tables with seating for 8 on each, and that left a seat for our guide, Alex, and also for the captain when he joined us. After our first superb meal on board and getting to know a few people, we decided that a walk was in order to see what the nightlife of Split was like. Busy was the answer. We were up at 6:30 this morning to make sure we could watch our departure from Split. There was already plenty of activity, with people queuing for the ferries. And our destination today is the island of Hvar. On our way to Hvar, we're to make a stop at Zlatni Rat, which means Golden Cape, on the island of Brač. Zlatni Rat is one of Croatia's best beaches, though with the overcast weather it doesn't look very golden this morning. But it's a chance to go ashore for an hour or so for those who wanted, or just to swim directly off the boat. Luka is the crewman in charge of the dinghy, and he just loves to show off when he's on his own at how he can steer the dinghy with his foot. After lunch there was another swim stop, where the crews had to swim ashore and tie the ropes up to rocks. The island of Hvar was an important base for controlling trade in the Adriatic and also the wider Mediterranean. It was the ancient Greeks who founded a colony here in 384 BC on the site of Stari Grad, the old town, now just known as Hvar, and that's where we're heading now. Hvar is now a very popular tourist centre with a busy dock. Visitors and locals like to watch the boats going to and fro. It's not the place to get things wrong, and Luca didn't. Once we were ashore, the Fantazija had to leave again. This dock is where the island ferries stop, and our boat was only allowed back in the evening when the ferries had stopped running. And so we set off around the old town with a guide for an hour. The town of Hvar has a population of just over 4,000, and for many of them their income is from tourism. But another source of income on the island is the growing of lavender, used in oils and soaps. Hvar is sometimes known as the Island of Lavender. With the temperature in the low 30s, it felt incredibly hot walking around, and so we huddled in the shade when we could to listen to our guide. It was a relief to get into the narrow lanes, which we found in all the old Croatian towns, where it was cooler. And we all wore earpieces on walks like this. For some reason, Alex, the guide on the ship, always referred to these as whispers. Later, on our own, we strolled around the harbour and looked for a place to stop for a drink. One bar was packed with locals gearing up for tonight's World Cup football match between Croatia and Denmark. But we found a great spot on the terrace of a hotel, which we had virtually to ourselves. And for dinner, we're at the Mediterraneo, a restaurant recommended by Unforgettable Croatia, for which we'd made a booking online before we left the UK. While we were eating, the ferries had stopped and the tourist boats were allowed back in. We had to walk through 6 other boats to reach ours. Our first stop today is the island of Bishovo and the Blue Cave. This is a natural cave which has an underwater opening through which the sunlight reflects up from the bottom to bathe the walls in blue. It's only accessible by very small boats, and so the Fantazija had to dock first to let us off and then move out of the way. The first boat we got into had a problem with its engine, so we had to pile out and get into another one. And while the cave is definitely worth a visit, they charge 100 kuna per person. That's about £12. So with 12 passengers in a boat, they're raking in about £144 for each short trip.
So guys, blue cave, 24 meter long, 16 meter deep. On this side, sun go inside in the water and reflection blue inside cave. Please turn on the flash on your mobile, no flash. So I think maybe you can try put your hand inside water and maybe you can see some reflection on your feet if you want. So guys, lights come here on this open, and this open is 2 meter deep and 4 meter long, and it's possible dive here and go outside cave. 2 meter deep and 4 meter long. Blue cave discovered 1884, Austrian Baron Eugen Ransonnet, and first time he come inside cave on this entrance. I show you this natural enter later when we go outside, because the enter where we come inside now is not natural enter. Underwater bridge. Ne, mislim ovaj je ovo isto mislim Fantazije. Ako bude trebalo, neko kaže.
By the time we came out of the cave, the wind was getting up and the sea becoming choppy. We heard later that the boats had to stop running soon after we left, so we were lucky to get to the cave when we did. With the Fantazija still anchored offshore, we were ferried straight over to it. The stop at the Blue Cave was quite early this morning, and we're heading now to the island of Vis, and not due there until late afternoon. So we've a day on board to relax, and to be given another 4-course lunch. I mean, the food on board is great, but there's far too much of it. Vis used to be a Yugoslav naval base, but now huge numbers of boats stop here. Once we docked, we strolled around part of the bay, trying to find a particular restaurant to book for later, but it was so hot that we gave up and sat in a nearby bar instead. From the bar, we spotted a very incongruous sight. Amongst the comparative opulence of all these tourist boats and expensive private yachts, an old lady came to the water's edge with a bucket on some string. She filled it with seawater, got out a bar of soap and started to wash her clothes, and she then put her things out to dry on nearby benches and bollards. Another day now spent mainly on the boat, as we make for the island of Korcula, and we're due there in the late afternoon. Korcula is often referred to as a mini Dubrovnik. It has a very checkered past, changing hands many times since it was allegedly founded here by the Trojans in the 12th century BC. The Venetian influence here is everywhere, and timber from here was used for years to build the wooden walls of Venice. This is Andrea, our local guide, who was informative and friendly, with a nice sense of humour, and who was probably the best local guide we met on the islands. The explorer Marco Polo is said to have been born in Korcula in 1254. We were shown what the town boasts as his birthplace, the Marco Polo House, but evidence shows it was actually built several hundred years later. The Philippi restaurant was another recommendation, so we reserved a table for later. When we went to the Philippi for dinner, we had a table right by the outer wall, overlooking the sea. It was perfect, and so was the food. And to end a lovely day, we took a short walk around the old walls and down to the water's edge to see the sunset. Today we reach the island of Mljet by way of some peaceful bays where we stopped. Unlike most of the older towns we'd been to, Mljet has a modern purpose-built port area. That's because it's close to a popular attraction, the Mljet National Park, where Alex was to take us on a walk, though to me it seemed more like a route march. Eventually we followed the edge of the first of two interconnected saltwater lakes, inland, but connected to the sea by a narrow canal. And on the second lake, we boarded a boat that took us to the islet of St. Mary, home to a former Benedictine monastery built here in the 12th century. Back on board Fantazija, we watch a local ferry arriving and have time for a drink before dinner. A couple of days ago, Kate, one of the Australians, asked every one of us, including the crew, to choose one song that we liked. She then used Spotify to put a playlist together, gentler music while we were eating, and livelier stuff for later. And here's our barmen, Fabian and Nicola. It was a very lively evening. Well, there didn't seem to be too many hangovers this morning, and we enjoyed a nice cool run from Mljet to our first swim stop. We were a little concerned about the two youngest children on the boat, who set off on an incredibly long swim to the shore. But we needn't have worried. They did it competently, and then swam back again.
And so they protected their salt by building a wall, huge wall, 5 kilometers. So the second longest wall in the world. So, but there's a huge gap between first and the second.
We are stopped at Slano on the Croatian mainland. Alex had been telling us about the place we're to visit by coach, the town of Ston. Ston was once a key fortress and stands at the western end of a stunning stretch of 14th century walls running high over the steep hills, and they link up to Mali Ston, Little Ston, about 2 miles away. It was baking hot here as our guide showed us around the town, and also the salt pans. She explained about the manufacture of salt in these pans, which were established as far back as the 13th century. But the production of salt here is believed to go back much further, and was why the Republic of Dubrovnik became so wealthy. And it's why the huge walls were needed to protect the salt from being plundered. From Mali Ston, we were taken by boat out onto what appeared to be a lake, but was actually a large seawater inlet. And we stayed on the boat as it tied up to a small platform in the centre of an oyster farm.
Collect baby oysters. 2 times a year. Yeah. They used wood before, and now they use plastic.
Fresh oysters were brought up, and the local owner explained about the process of farming oysters, with Alex translating. The oysters here are described as being some of the most delicious in the world. I did try one, but didn't really see the point of it. If all you do is swallow it whole, then all you get is a salty taste with a squeeze of lemon on it. David said that instead you might as well pick up a pebble from the water and lick it.
Guys from Texas, and this place. And I'm like, well, what's the point of these things?
We put too much lemon on it then. No. That's rich. No, do you want the last one?
Mussels were brought out as well for us to taste. Again, I tried one. I thought it was a little more tasty than the oyster, but not much. Alex enjoyed tucking into a bowl, though, as we headed back by boat and by coach to Slano. Slano is a small town with plenty of Greek and Roman ruins and monuments, but we didn't have time to visit them as well. We have to get ready for the captain's dinner, where tonight we're to have live music. After last night's amazing atmosphere, the live band tonight were a bit of an anticlimax. They seemed very loud later, making conversation difficult. And once we'd finished eating, we went outside on the piazza, where a much nicer trio was playing jazz and bossa nova. This is our last day on board Fantazija, and one which we're looking forward to a lot, as it takes us to our last destination, Dubrovnik. We're to reach there after breakfast, and we made sure we were up early to enjoy some of the scenery on the way. And here we are, a wonderful way to arrive at this medieval city as we sail slowly around its ancient walls. The harbour in the old city is very small, so we can't stop there for 24 hours. Instead, we make our way back up north to the area where the large cruise ships dock. And this is where we moor up, right underneath the Franjo Tuđman Bridge, named after Croatia's first president. A coach took us into town, and we go first to the cable car, a 4-minute ride taking us up 2,500 feet with spectacular views over the city and the nearby islands. And here at the top is the Homeland War Museum. The Croatian War of Independence, which was fought between 1991 and 95, enabled Croatia to break away from Yugoslavia. As part of this war, the siege of Dubrovnik lasted for 8 months in 1991 until the Yugoslavs withdrew. Nearly 300 military and civilians were killed in those 8 months, more than 11,000 buildings damaged in bombardments, and 16,000 refugees were evacuated by sea. Back down by the harbour, a local guide took us through the massive stone tower at the entrance gates on a tour of the old city. Again, it was very hot, and through our earpieces we listened to our guide, or pretended to, as she droned on, and it was a wonderful relief when we reached the bus terminal at the gates opposite and she shut up. Once we had regained our freedom, we found a cafe where we could relax and enjoy a cold drink. And then we went to the restaurant Dubrovnik, another recommended to us, and the best of the holiday. It was interesting walking back to the taxi rank through the narrow lanes and traffic-free streets to see that the stones beneath us were incredibly highly polished by the feet of tourists and locals going back centuries. They were so shiny, they looked wet. Today we said goodbye to the new friends we'd made on the Fantazija, and along with a few others boarded a coach to be taken to our respective hotels. We were the last to be dropped off at the Hotel Mljet. Mljet just means sea. The hotel is built on steep cliffs on a peninsula about a couple of miles from the old town. It's on 9 floors stretching from the road level at the top down to the sea. It was a few hours before we could check in, so we relaxed with a coffee and explored what seemed like quite a rabbit warren to begin with. And almost down at sea level was a bar built into a cave that was discovered here. Well, we'd asked for a sea view, and this was it. So we just unpacked, read our books, and sat and enjoyed it, until going down to dinner at one of the open restaurants overlooking the water. The next morning we had an early start, as our guide, Baldo, arrived on the dot to take us to Kotor in Montenegro, and we had to go early to avoid the queues at the border crossing. Apparently it can sometimes take a couple of hours there. Our drive took us around the bay of Kotor, and we stopped to look at this little island, which we didn't realise we'd be visiting later. Perast was a beautiful little village on the shores of the bay. It looks as if this is a lake, but it's a huge seawater inlet with an entrance through a narrow strait, but it's wide enough and deep enough for huge cruise ships to get through. With Baldo we were ferried across to that tiny island to see the Church of Our Lady of the Rocks. The island is an artificial one, created by dropping thousands of rocks on the spot and by sinking old and seized ships loaded with rocks. And the reason given for building it there is that local sailors found an icon of the Madonna and Child on a rock there and built the church to honour her. But that doesn't make sense, because originally there was no island there on which to find an icon. Well, now the church contains votive offerings, many in silver, a collection of paintings and tapestries, and of course a gift shop. The old town of Kotor, like Korcula and Dubrovnik, is surrounded by huge fortifications built during the Venetian period in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the original fortress goes back to the early Middle Ages and the year 535 AD. Our local guide here was waiting to take us on a tour of the old town and its churches and palaces. And this is another extremely popular tourist centre, and the large cruise ships can disgorge thousands of people at a time. So we were very lucky there were no ships here today, but it seemed quite busy enough anyway. After a stop for a drink and a sandwich, we took a short walk on part of the walls before heading back to the car park to find Baldo. Baldo then wanted to show us what seemed almost like a modern ghost town, a very new and expensive area. There were modern luxury apartments and huge private yachts moored in the port, protected by security gates. And there's a heavy Russian presence here. Road signs are in Russian, and if you don't speak Russian, you won't get a job as a waiter or shop assistant. To head back, we didn't have to drive all round the bay again. We crossed the small strait I mentioned earlier by ferry. Once back in Croatia, we took a detour and drove along old tracks out onto a peninsula where an old fort overlooked the Strait of Otranto. The strait has been important strategically since ancient times, when the Romans used it to move their troops east. But a battle here in May 1917 saw some of the largest action in the Adriatic during the First World War. We then followed the coast road to take us back to Dubrovnik. It's our last full day, and we're waiting for a taxi to take us into Dubrovnik. We'd decided that we couldn't possibly leave Croatia without taking a walk up on the spectacular walls of the old city. And although it was hot, there was a nice breeze there. Because a lot of damage was done to Dubrovnik in the siege of 1991, many buildings and walls have had to be restored. And looking down, it's easy to see the newer red roofs on houses that were hit. And up on the walls we bumped into Deborah and Mark, fellow passengers on the Fantazija. That's Deborah with the parasol. We had noticed that there was a Dali exhibition in one building, so decided to go in. They were mainly some of his smaller works, both originals and prints. This round building is the 15th century fountain, fed by an aqueduct and once the city's main water supply. The water is still drinkable today. Just off the main street, in a very peaceful spot, is the Franciscan monastery. We saw just a small part of what now comprises a monastery, a church, a library, and a pharmacy, the third oldest still working pharmacy in the world, dating from when building work started here in 1317. Back at our hotel in the afternoon, We did most of our packing ready for the journey home tomorrow, and relaxed a little before heading back into the old city for the last time to have dinner once more at Restaurant Dubrovnik.